swiftly across the globe. It brought a new disease onto our headlines, our dinner table conversations, and eventually our shores. From the beginning, we followed the guidance of public health officials. Governments across Canada have put lockdown measures in place to slow the spread of the virus and ensure that our healthcare systems could deal with the scale of the challenge that we faced. Businesses closed, schools closed, people stayed home. Our daily lives became unrecognizable. Many of us stopped going to work. Many others had to face this new reality without a job and the endless worries that that brings. Many others had to go to work on the front lines, where work took on new risks and new meaning. We went months without seeing our friends and relatives in a time of great fear and concern. We looked for new ways to gather, to connect, to mark the milestones in our lives. We spent a lot of time on video calls. And most importantly, we took the time to take care of one another. The nature of this crisis is completely unprecedented. It's a public health crisis and an economic crisis. Our collective decisions as Canadians to put each other's health above all else has meant we've flattened the curve faster than many other countries. Our average daily new cases have declined by about 80% from their peak in late April. Canadians' efforts saved thousands of lives. But Canadians also made great sacrifices to get here. Millions of Canadians have lost their jobs, lost hours, or lost wages. Businesses of all sizes are still facing uncertainty. En apportant un soutien rapide et large, nous avons été en mesure de préserver des millions d'emplois, d'offrir un revenu d'urgence aux familles et d'aider les entreprises à rester à flot au plus fort de la tempête. L'aide que nous avons donnée aux Canadiens et Canadiennes pour se remettre sur pied a permis d'éviter de graves répercussions à long terme. La pandémie n'est pas terminée et nous ne pouvons pas abandonner l'engagement que nous avons pris les uns envers les autres. Je tiens à prendre un instant pour souligner l'important travail de le ministère de la Santé et de le Dr. Tam pendant la crise actuelle. Today, our government is presenting an economic and fiscal snapshot. This document provides Canadians and parliamentarians with a picture of where our economy is right now. It's transparent about what we know and what we don't know. Forecasts are always uncertain. So with this snapshot, we're providing our best prediction of the economic situation in Canada to the end of the current fiscal year, to March 31st, 2021. Trying to predict further would be potentially misleading. La possibilité d'autres éclosions continue de se profiler à l'horizon et il est impossible de faire des prévisions exactes dans cet environnement instable. Je sais que les Canadiens et les Canadiennes comprennent à quel point il est difficile de faire des prédictions en ce moment. Alors permettez-moi de vous faire part de ce que nous savons. Le taux de chômage est passé de creux historiques en janvier à des sommets historiques en mai. Nous savons que les travailleurs à faible revenu, les jeunes et les nouveaux immigrants ont subi le plus de pertes d'emplois en mars et en avril. Et bien qu'un regain de l'emploi ait eu lieu en mai, les secteurs dans lesquels de nombreuses femmes travaillent ont été plus lents à rebondir. Nous savons que de nombreuses femmes assument le fardeau de travail non rémunéré à la maison, s'occupent des enfants et s'occupent de parents malades. L'absence de services de garde pourrait retarder le retour des femmes au travail. Nous avons aussi constaté que les groupes vulnérables ont été particulièrement touchés par la pandémie et continuent de faire face à des problèmes. Cette crise a révélé et amplifié de nombreuses inégalités au Canada. Je pense aux Canadiens qui travaillent pour se débrouiller avec un faible revenu, aux gens qui transforment et préparent notre nourriture, aux travailleurs étrangers temporaires, à nos aînés en soins de longue durée. We know that energy workers faced a double hit after the shock to global commodity prices, and that employment in mining and oil and gas support services has fallen by over 15%. We know businesses are still facing challenges. The Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy is helping impacted businesses protect jobs and remain poised to rebound. We encourage businesses to take advantage of the program and hire more workers. We know that the best economic policy continues to be containing the spread of the virus. If we can keep the transmission rate steadily declining, we can help ensure a stable and steady economic recovery. If we don't, the gains of our sacrifices these past 4 months will be lost. Around the world, we've seen what happens when reopenings are rushed. Notre gouvernement a compris, dès le début de cette pandémie, que nous devions intervenir pour soutenir les Canadiens et stabiliser l'économie. Le plan d'intervention économique pour répondre à la COVID-19 est l'investissement en temps de paix le plus important de l'histoire du Canada. Il représente plus de 212 milliards de dollars en soutien direct et près de 14% de PIB. Permettez-moi de vous donner quelques chiffres. Environ 3 millions de travailleuses et de travailleurs canadiens ont vu leur emploi protégé par la subvention salariale d'urgence du Canada. Et ce nombre continue de croître. Plus de 8 millions de Canadiens et de Canadiennes ont pu payer leur épicerie et leur loyer grâce à la prestation canadienne d'urgence. Plus de 680 000 petites entreprises ont reçu des prêts sans intérêt grâce au compte d'urgence pour les entreprises canadiennes. 15 millions de Canadiens à revenus faibles ou modestes ont reçu un crédit spécial pour le TPS. 6,7 millions d'aînés qui reçoivent une pension de la sécurité de la vieillesse recevront un paiement supplémentaire cette semaine. Nous avons également investi dans des organismes communautaires qui offrent des services aux plus vulnérables, notamment dans plus de 500 refuges pour femmes qui répondent aux besoins immédiats des femmes et des enfants fuyant la violence. Le leadership du Premier ministre a montré à tout le Canada que son gouvernement accorderait la priorité aux travailleurs et serait là pour les plus vulnérables. Et s'il y a d'autres vagues, nous sommes prêts à le faire plus. Faced with the most profound depression since the Great Depression, profound downturn since the Great Depression, our government acted to support the economy. Every investment we made was in response to COVID-19 and was time limited. From income support for Canadians to loans for Canadian businesses and nonprofits of all sizes, we worked to make sure our programs left no one behind, and we did it fast. We were guided by 3 principles: speed, scale, and simplicity. Mr. Speaker, I think we delivered on all 3. Some will criticize us on the cost of action. They'll point to the size of our deficit in 2021. It's a testament of the shock that COVID-19 had on our economy. But our government knew that the cost of inaction would have been far greater. Those who would have us do less ignore that without government action, millions of jobs would have been lost, putting the burden of debt onto families and jeopardizing Canada's resilience. At a time when Canadian workers and families are facing significant hardship, austerity and tightening your belt is not the answer. Our fiscal discipline in the years leading up to this, combined with Canadians' hard work and entrepreneurial spirit, meant that Canada was resilient and ready to face this challenge. With a crisis of this magnitude, someone was going to have to shoulder the costs, and the federal government was uniquely placed to take this responsibility on. Over the last quarter century, provincial debt has outpaced federal debt by $225 billion. Household debt to disposable income has increased to over 175%, close to a record high. To date, nearly 9 out of $10 in COVID-19 related direct support delivered to Canadians and to Canadian businesses is financed by the federal government. We took on this role because it was the right thing to do. Thanks to our rapid and substantial investments, unemployment will be lower, consumer spending will be higher, and our economy will recover sooner than had we done nothing. Si nous n'étions pas intervenus avec la subvention salariale d'urgence du Canada, des millions d'emplois auraient pu être perdus à jamais pendant le pire de la tempête. Sans la prestation canadienne d'urgence, un bon nombre de Canadiens et Canadiennes n'auront pas été en mesure de payer leurs dépenses quotidiennes. Grâce à nos investissements, la population et les entreprises canadiennes n'auront pas à s'endetter ou à fermer boutique, mais seront plutôt en meilleure position pour la relance. Nous étions en bonne position lorsque la crise s'est déclarée. Notre ratio de la dette nette au PIB était considérablement bas que celui de tous nos homologues de G7. Even after our historic investments, Canada will continue to hold this low debt advantage. This, combined with historically low interest rates, gave us the balance sheet to deploy our fiscal firepower to support Canadians through this. If we think back to the 1990s, when Canada's debt needed to be reined in, interest rates were high and public debt was extremely expensive. At that time, our public debt charges were close to 6% of gross domestic product. But now, Canada's debt charges are only around 1% of GDP. And even after all the investments we've made to support Canadians, the cost of servicing our debt is expected to go lower this year. In fact, our total public debt charges for 2020 will actually be $4 billion lower than forecasted last fall. But we, the collective we, will have to face up to our borrowing, ensure that it's sustainable for future generations. Canada's debt structure is prudent. It's spread out over the long term, and it compares well to our G7 peers. And we'll continue to make sure this is the case in the months and years to come as we move toward recovery and as we deal with the aftermath of this unprecedented event. Durant cette crise, sous le leadership du Premier ministre, nous avons travaillé en collaboration avec les gouvernements provinciaux et territoriaux pour protéger les Canadiens comme jamais auparavant. Depuis mars, le Premier ministre et la vice-Premier ministre ont tenu 15 réunions des Premiers ministres. J'ai personnellement pris part à 14 réunions avec les ministres provinciaux et territoriaux des Finances. Nous avons accompli beaucoup ensemble en fournissant des centaines de millions de pièces d'équipement de protection individuelle pour veiller à ce que les travailleurs de la santé disposent d'un approvisionnement fiable. Nous avons travaillé pour donner une augmentation de salaire bien méritée aux travailleurs essentiels. Il était évident pour nous tous que nos actions collectives nous permettraient de passer à travers cette crise. Monsieur le Président, les Canadiens veulent retourner au travail, mais ils veulent le faire de façon sécuritaire. C'est pourquoi nous travaillons avec les provinces et les territoires à conclure une entente de relance sécuritaire de plus de 14 milliards de dollars. Nous proposons d'investir dans des services de garde d'enfants sûrs, suffisants et adéquats pour que les parents, surtout les mères, n'aient pas à choisir entre travailler et prendre soin de leur enfant. Nous voulons également renforcer la capacité de test et de retraçage des contacts et continuer à offrir des soins de santé de calibre mondial à travers le pays. Ces discussions seront essentielles au bien-être des Canadiens et des Canadiennes. The road to economic recovery will be long and uncertain. Going forward, anything we do must be about growth, resilience, creating opportunity for those who are most impacted by this crisis. We need to invest in an economy that's greener and more diverse, an economy that creates opportunity for young people, for low-income Canadians, for people with disabilities, for women, and that supports our most vulnerable, including LGBTQ2 communities, Indigenous peoples, Black Canadians, and other racialized people in our country. This pandemic has identified clear gaps, and it's giving us a chance to reset. We witnessed the ways in which people were falling through the cracks, particularly those who live in long-term care. Many of them are our parents and our grandparents who built this country. We need to do better by them. In the coming months, we'll need to come to these problems with dedication, with compassion, and with ingenuity. Mr. Speaker, 80 years ago, Canada faced some of the worst days of the Second World War, and the government faced monumental and difficult choices. In this House, like today, there were those who criticized them for not doing enough, others who said they went too far. But despite the criticisms of the debate, the resolve of Canadians to fearlessly face the emergency of their time never wavered. Today, as we evaluate the details of our measures and the scale of their reach, I want to tell this House that we left no stone unturned. And every decision we made was guided by our belief that the well-being of Canadians had to come above all else. We've worked to lay out an economic response plan that's comprehensive, that's ambitious, and that serves those who need help the most. We've done so in the belief that Canadians would be able to fight the spread of this virus and come roaring back. We've done this to build a bridge to a safer place from which we can build a stronger and more resilient future. Just like in the Second World War, I know that Canadians have what it takes to come together for the greater good. I've seen it in healthcare workers, 80% of them women, many of them immigrants, who day in and day out put their own health at risk to help others. I've seen it in the businesses that have retooled to build ventilators, masks, gowns, and more. I've seen it in the women and men of the armed forces who've served by caring for our most vulnerable in our long-term care homes. I've seen it in the millions of small donations, small acts of kindness, and the big and small sacrifices Canadians have made to fight this virus. I want to take this moment to send a message to those who have lost loved ones during this time. All of Canada shares in your pain. Canadians are resourceful. Canadians are resilient. Together we'll get through this and build a better, fairer, and stronger Canada. Merci.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, so much of what the Finance Minister just said is not true, but I don't have enough time to enumerate it all because we only have a few minutes for questions and comments. This government was wrong. They were wrong to leave our borders open for longer. They were wrong when they said they were going to have enhanced screening at airports, and they were slow to fix the gaps in their own programs. So many Canadians have been let down by this government. They have refused to fix the wage subsidy. They have refused to remove the back-to-work penalty for people who want to take available shifts, and they have refused to implement the back-to-work bonus that Conservatives have proposed to help people fill available shifts and help local businesses get back on their feet. They have also refused to fund the Auditor General so that she can keep track of this massive amount of new spending, historic levels of deficits and debt. All she wanted was about $10 million to make sure she can go through the programs. But he did find $15 million kicking around for the Deputy Prime Minister's political office. So can the Finance Minister tell this House exactly what the $15 million that he gave the Deputy Prime Minister will be going for, too?
The Honourable Finance Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we have, during the course of the last number of months, taken as our very first order of business to support Canadians, to back them up, to create jobs, to help provide a bridge towards the future. But at no time during this period have we forgotten that governing our country is equally important. We have tried to make sure that we could continue to have the government work, to make sure that we could actually deliver for Canadians. One of the biggest challenges we've faced as we've done this is thinking about how we actually deliver to Canadians. When the history of this pandemic is written, I think that history will say that we delivered not only at scale, but at speed. And that's because we not only came up with the right policies, but we found a way to deliver them. What I will say is that our government will continue to make sure that the resources to be able to create that policy, to be able to deliver those results to Canadians is there. And I would say that the Deputy Prime Minister is one of those important people in our government that has helped us to make an enormous difference during this challenging time, and she will continue to do that as an important member of our government.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de la Prairie.
Merci, M. le Président. Écoutez, on nous a convaincus que le gouvernement avait fait les dépenses voulues à un moment exceptionnel. Tout le monde le voit bien, évidemment, avec un déficit de 343 milliards. Là, on le sent aussi très bien. Mais il y a quelque chose qu'on oublie, c'est que ce sont les provinces et le Québec qui ont été sur le feu de la rampe avec les dépenses en santé. Ce sont les provinces et le Québec qui ont eu à répondre à cette pandémie et à faire en sorte que le système de santé puisse répondre adéquatement aux besoins exceptionnels qu'on avait à combler à cause de la situation. Au début, le gouvernement libéral a donné 500 millions aux provinces et au Québec. Ça équivaut à peu près à 100 millions pour le Québec. Récemment, le gouvernement du Québec a dit que les dépenses seulement en santé supplémentaires causées par la pandémie, ça dépassait les 3 milliards de dollars et on n'a pas fini de compter.
And that wraps up our special here on Global News. Finance Minister Bill Morneau delivering a $343.2 billion deficit. We were anticipating around the $300 billion mark, so significantly beyond that, hinting that there is more to come potentially in employer wage support programs as the government continues to try to find their way forward through the finances of this pandemic. Benefiting, though, from low interest rates, the government insists that they believe in the actions they've taken. They will continue to take ongoing action going forward. But again, a $343.2 billion deficit announced today. That puts the country into over $1 trillion worth of debt. No major new announcements or new programs. Largely a rehash in this document of what has been going on so far up to date in terms of government announcements. But again, keep your eye on what might be happening with employer wage support. It sounds like the government is preparing to put more money into that based on their numbers in this report. That's all the time we have here today in Ottawa. We will bring you the latest on this and all the other stories off Parliament Hill. I'm Mercedes Stevenson for Global News. Back to you in Toronto.
Good journalism isn't just about covering the story. It's about exposing the truth. That's why we dug into the dirty money fueling Canada's deadly drug epidemic. Why we uncovered the government's secret plan to harvest your personal financial data. And how we found crooked pharmacists in Ontario.
And but for a Global News report, Canadians would never know.
Investigative reporting that leads to real change. Global News. Want weather on the go? Pinpointed with the free Global News Sky Tracker weather app. Reliable, accurate, and easy to use.
Mr. Speaker, and as the Minister knows, I'm a former teacher. So I'd like to give my grades for him on this economic and fiscal snapshot. First, an A for accessibility. There is no doubt that the Finance Minister, though he is working very hard, has been accessible to finance critics and to the Finance Committee every week. And I think that is appreciated and that collaboration is important. Secondly, in terms of expenditures, I would give a passing note of perhaps C+. Now that mark, that grade could be higher if supports are given to people with disabilities. The poorest of the poor in this country who've not received a single cent throughout this pandemic, though the banking sector has received $750 billion, $750 billion. People with disabilities should be coming before bankers, in my opinion, Mr. Speaker. And supports for municipalities, supports to changes in the wage subsidy can also bring that grade up. But the grade in terms of revenues is an F, Mr. Speaker. The reality is no action in this economic and fiscal snapshot addresses what is a porous and appallingly unfair tax system. There's no action on tax havens, though that costs us $25 billion a year. There's no action on the wealth tax, though the PBO says that that could provide $6 to $9 billion a year, and the increasing concentration of wealth means this must be an imperative. No action on the web giants who are getting away with not paying their fair share of taxes. And nothing that actually addresses the revenue side so we can continue to provide services and enhance services to Canadians. We cannot afford the free ride that so many profitable corporations in Canada have been receiving, and we cannot afford anymore this profoundly unfair tax system. So why doesn't the snapshot take action on the revenue side? Why doesn't it take action on tax havens? Why doesn't it take action on a wealth tax? Why doesn't it take action on tax loopholes? This would give a higher grade overall to the Finance Minister.
Honourable Finance Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me first just acknowledge that that the critics in all parties in this House and the finance critics have tried to work constructively all the way through this. We've worked to listen to their commentary, just like we've worked to listen to the commentary from business groups, from labor groups across the country. The nature of this pandemic has meant that we have had to act with speed and with scale. It's also meant we've needed to make changes as we've moved along in the delivery of the programs that we're doing to make sure they actually have the desired impact on Canadians. That will be our continued approach as we face up to these challenges. The member, my opposite member, points out something that I think is important. We do believe that it's important for us to recognize that there are some challenges that people with disabilities have faced over the course of the time of the pandemic, and that is something that he's brought up to me on numerous occasions and something that we are certainly trying to work towards. We will continue to think about the ways that we can address this pandemic. We will be focusing right now on the safe restart, working together, we hope, with Canadians across the country, with people in this House, so that we can safely and appropriately get back to work. And that will allow us, we hope, to find a way to ensure that our system works, that we have the appropriate revenues, and that we have a way to move back to an approach where we can invest in the long-term future of Canadians.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands. We have about 50 seconds left.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Honourable Finance Minister. I echo the comments from my friend from the New Democratic Party finance critic. The Minister has indeed been accessible. I have a very specific question. I mean, this document is a snapshot. I know that if you have a crystal ball, it's pretty murky right now. We can't see very far ahead. But I do wonder how it is that we've referred at page 20 of this document to the payment to people with disabilities as though it has happened. We know it has not.
The Honourable Finance Minister.
I want to thank the member for her question. What we are demonstrating with this document is all of the policies that we've put forward that we are working to actually deliver on for Canadians. We recognize that there's things that we don't know, so there will be future actions that we will likely have to take because this pandemic is dynamic. But we did recognize in this House the importance of dealing with people with disabilities, and we certainly hope that we will find support in this House for moving forward with that support.
Resuming debate, reprise du débat, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I will be sharing my time with the Honourable Member for Carleton, one of the great, hard-working finance shadow ministers that the Minister referenced, was doing so much good work to try to help fix the gaps in the government's programs. Mr. Speaker, the Finance Minister has just painted an extremely dire picture of Canada's finances. But what we didn't hear was any kind of a plan to support the reopening of our economy and to get Canadians back to work. Coming out of the pandemic, every single country on the planet will be desperately competing for the same opportunities and the same investments. So where is the Prime Minister's plan to set us apart? The United Kingdom has a plan. France, Germany, South Korea, Japan, they all have plans. In fact, every single country in the G7 has a plan. Le gouvernement emprunte 300.
The government is borrowing $343 billion this year. But the Prime Minister has no plan whatsoever to help Canadians return to work, no plan to guide our economic recovery, no plan to stimulate growth, attract business investment, or create the conditions for job growth.
The government is borrowing $343 billion this year. For the first time ever, this year, the net federal debt will reach over $1 trillion. In fact, they're borrowing so much money, Mr. Speaker, that the Bank of Canada has to create it out of thin air. The Bank of Canada is purchasing $5 billion worth of government debt every single week. The Prime Minister has absolutely no plan to help Canadians return to work, no plan to guide our economic recovery, no plan to stimulate growth, attract business investment, or to create the conditions for job growth. I know this might come as a shock to a Liberal Prime Minister, but spending billions of dollars does not create economic growth. And handing it out to Liberal insiders certainly won't restart our economy. More Liberal tax hikes, more red tape won't restart our economy. Pour être concurrentiel, nous devons...
To remain competitive, we have to free the power of the private sector, help Canadians go back to work, support small businesses, cut taxes, eliminate red tape, and make Canada an attractive place to do business again.
Conception right now on the economy is that if we simply lift the restrictions and provinces reopen, our economy will come roaring back to life. The reality is it will take leadership, big ideas, and a lot of hard work. But the Prime Minister's track record proves that he cannot be trusted to lead Canada's recovery. His sky-high taxes, wasteful spending, and massive deficits put Canada in an incredibly weak position before the pandemic began. While a responsible government would have saved while times were good and paid down debt, as our previous Conservative government did, the Liberals added $87 billion worth of new debt during their first 4 years of power. As a result, Canada is the only G7 country to have lost its AAA credit rating and has one of the highest debt levels in the AA category. Before the pandemic, Canada's unemployment rate was higher than all G7 countries, except France and Italy, whose socialist policies the Prime Minister was trying to emulate. Now Canada has surpassed them and has the highest unemployment rate in the G7. In fact, we have among the highest unemployment rates in the OECD, falling fourth, right behind Greece. So this should be a major wake-up call for this government. C'est sûr que les Canadiens luttent.
Canadians are struggling. The last months have been truly difficult. Millions of people have lost their jobs. More than 100,000 Canadians are ill and thousands have died. Businesses have closed and many of them will never reopen. Canadians have been horrified to see their savings disappear.
Despite all of this, as provinces gradually reopen, Canadians are hopeful and optimistic about their futures. They want to work. Businesses want to reopen, to welcome back staff and customers. They are determined to rebuild and are coming up with innovative ways to offer services as provinces. Now, I don't know why the Prime Minister always feels the need to talk down Canada, Mr. Speaker. Canadians are an endlessly enterprising people. Perhaps it's a product of our immigrant society where people leave the familiarity of home for a shot at a better life on the other side of the world and then work hard to achieve it. Perhaps it's the inspiration we take from Indigenous peoples, resilient men and women who built Canada's first communities in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. Perhaps it's our belief in freedom, limited government, and the power of the free market. Regardless of the reason, Canadians have proven time and time again that through hard work, innovation, and perseverance, we can accomplish anything. Mr. Speaker, Canada's economic recovery will be driven by Canadians. Governments don't create jobs, and you can't borrow your way to prosperity. True success comes from investing in people. But the only people that the Liberals are interested in investing in are the wealthy elites. While regular Canadians continue to struggle, the Prime Minister is passing buckets of money around the highest levels of corporate Canada. It started in the last Parliament when they developed their superclusters program, handing out billions and billions of dollars to corporate entities and wealthy institutions. They gave $50 million to MasterCard, $12 million for Loblaws. They gave $35 billion to the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, which protects wealthy investors and puts all the risk on the backs of taxpayers. And how many projects has that new infrastructure bank actually completed? 0. Wow. And the Bank of Canada, as I said earlier, is printing money. Now, the Finance Minister just bragged about the low cost of servicing that debt. Well, there's a reason why, Mr. Speaker. It's because the Bank of Canada is purchasing government debt on the secondary bond market. So they are creating money out of thin air. And who gets that money first? Wealthy investors who already purchased government debt in the past. Mr. Speaker, this is the epitome of trickle-down economics, throwing money around at the highest levels of corporate Canada while raising taxes on hard-working Canadians. In the middle of a pandemic and all the economic difficulty that this pandemic has caused, they raised the carbon tax, raising payroll taxes and raising excise taxes. Meanwhile, no help for energy workers. They refuse to fix their flawed programs. The Finance Minister talked about the need for speed. Well, we all agreed back in March that the government had to act quickly. And we were told that if Parliament passed these measures, that they would be fixed as time went on. I note the date, Mr. Speaker. It's the 8th of July. They still have not fixed the flaws in the wage subsidy. There are still thousands and thousands of people who have lost their jobs because of the gaps in that program. They refuse to make any adjustments on the rental subsidies, requiring businesses to have lost 70% of revenue before they qualify. And of course, they refuse to take away the barrier to people returning back to work by adopting the back to work bonus that the Conservatives have proposed. And we can't forget that in the middle of this pandemic, this Prime Minister has let so many Canadians fall behind. Depuis le début de la pandémie,
From the beginning of the pandemic, the Conservatives have presented constructive solutions to help Canadians. Our goal is to help workers and local businesses get back on their feet as quickly as possible. It was very disappointing when the Prime Minister did not use the economic profile offered today to include the back-to-work bonus, which is part of the Conservative plan to make the Canada Emergency Response Benefit more flexible and generous for workers to earn while businesses gradually reopen.
To our recovery. A good job helps Canadians succeed. It helps their families succeed. It helps build our communities and ultimately makes our country stronger. Under this Prime Minister, Canada and Canadians are losing out. We're falling behind. We're falling behind every other nation in the G7. That is unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. Canadians deserve a government that stands up for their interests. They deserve better than what they just got today.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I see a totally different picture than the one that the Leader of the Official Opposition has just portrayed. I see a government that has been demonstrating caring, compassion, a government that has worked with other levels of government of all political stripes to make sure that Canadians in all regions of our great nation are being looked after, that they are in fact the #1 priority of this government, of this cabinet, and this Prime Minister. That is what I have witnessed. We have seen programs come from virtually nowhere, not being of non-existence, programs like SERVE, to serving millions of Canadians, providing the disposable income that is so critical for them to be able to buy the things that are necessary, Madam Speaker. I have seen businesses that have been saved to the degree in which millions of jobs have been saved as a direct response. I have seen opposition members come to the table in a positive way to contribute to making life better for all Canadians. This is a government that truly cares and has the compassion and has put Canadians first and foremost as the #1 priority. My question to the member opposite, would he not agree that it is time that we look and focus on what's in the best interest of the families of Canada and get behind programs like providing more support for Canadians with disabilities?
Leader of the Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, I'm not surprised the member has selective memory when it comes to the last few months. It seems like he's stuck in March. He's stuck, I think it was about March 22nd, when everybody realized that we were in an unprecedented situation. And we all agreed that we would come back to Parliament to give the government the tools they needed to help Canadians. And what did his party do with that opportunity? before members of parliament had even gathered in this chamber, before we had even figured out how to stay 6 feet apart, 2 meters, this government wrote themselves a massive power grab, trying to eliminate the role of Parliament. In the middle of a pandemic, when people were losing their jobs and losing loved ones, the first thought this party had was, how can we benefit politically from it? And then when we pointed out time and time again the gaps that people were falling through the wage subsidy, through the CERB and the penalty for going back to work, the rental subsidy, they have refused to make any of those changes, leaving thousands of Canadians behind. That is the legacy that this government will take into the next election, and I have no doubt that Canadians will not reward them for their slowness, their poor decisions, and their inaction.
L'honorable député de la Prairie, questions and comments.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you. The Bloc Québécois had proposed modulating CERB. Regardless of the amount or hours worked, one would always have an increase as one worked. It seemed evident. We asked the government to act, and the Deputy Prime Minister had accepted looking into it and had committed to implementing it. At the time, the Conservatives had remained silent about that. And a few weeks ago, we saw them present the idea that, yes, modulating CERB was a good idea. Why is it a good idea? Because that way we encourage people to go back to work. That means it's not a break to growth. It would be easier if CERB encouraged people to go back to work. That's what the government of Quebec keeps telling us. On the other hand, if people go back to work, it's easy to understand. It's less expensive in terms of paying out CERB. Everyone wins. Government revenue increases because growth is stronger, and government expenditures diminish because people are going back to work and everybody's happy. That way, we have a situation where we improve the outcome for our communities. The Conservative Party has seen the light and is on our side. Does the leader of the official opposition think that if we had modulated the CERB from the very beginning? I'm sorry, we have 5 minutes for questions and comments. We need to give the opportunity for an answer, but I need to include 3 minutes in a 5-minute time period, and that doesn't give other parties time. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. First of all, Madam Speaker, the Conservatives support the idea of eliminating barriers to people who want to go back to work. And it's a compliment that the Bloc Québécois has given to the Conservative, that they stole our idea. It is a great compliment. Our party had proposed the idea of providing incentives for Canadians to go back to work. Our Shadow Minister of Finance had proposed that idea. It is thanks to the very hard work of our Conservative team that moved forward ideas to improve the disastrous programs, depending on some situations, of the Liberal government. If the Bloc Québécois has seen the light and is supporting our position, that's a good thing, Madam Chair.
Once again, I just want to remind that there's 5 minutes for questions and comments. We're going to try to get 3 questions in. Unfortunately, there's not enough time, and I would remind members to keep their questions short enough so that we can allow others to ask questions. The Honourable Member for Carleton.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. What we witnessed today was, for the first time in history, something a government called a fiscal and economic snapshot. A snapshot is defined in most dictionaries as sort of a quick photograph, or in modern lingo we call it a selfie, an economic selfie. But this finance minister, in talking for about 15 minutes straight, could not bring himself to utter the size of the debt or the deficit. Now, I will be the first, apparently, to do so. I ask all members to ensure they are in their seats and that they if anyone out there is listening to this speech while operating heavy equipment, you might want to turn the volume down. This government has now smashed through the $1 trillion debt mark. $1.06 trillion is the size of Canada's national debt. A deficit of $343 billion. To put that into perspective, when this government took office, the entire budget of the Government of Canada was about $260 billion. In other words, they are borrowing more in 1 year than the Government of Canada used to spend in its entire budget not long ago. Wow. Now, the Finance Minister went to great lengths to brag about the low interest rates that he's paying on the debt, as though he somehow set those interest rates himself, which raises questions about his perception of the Bank of Canada's independence. But what he forgets is that those interest rates are temporary, and they're only made possible by the cornucopia of cash that is coming out of the Bank of Canada. A bank which has created through keystrokes on a computer about $400 billion of new currency for government spending in less than 100 days. In other words, that's almost equal to a full quarter of GDP created out of thin air by our central bank. Now, the Prime Minister thinks he's discovered a new idea in creating currency in order to spend it. He'd best look back to history to know that this method of financing state activity can only go on for so long. I raise all of this not because the programs to support Canadians and replace the wages that governments have taken away from them are unnecessary. They're very necessary, of course. When government deprives people through lockdowns and shutdowns of their ability to earn an income, it is the government's job to compensate them for that. And such measures have been necessary and generally, with exception, supported by the official opposition. That said, we know that no nation can go on consuming without producing. The only way for us to continue to exist economically is to once again unleash the full and incomparable power of Canada's 20 million person workforce. Hear, hear, hear. To let free the more than 1 million entrepreneurs and businesses that employ those workers. And that should have been the purpose of today's address, instead of a temporary moment of self-congratulation combined with hypnotic phrases intended to make us feel comfortable with the $1 trillion of debt. We expected the Finance Minister would arrive here today with a plan to bring our economy back to life. Instead, what he did is brag that his plan is the most expensive plan in the G7. He said, because it consumes 10% of GDP, higher than any other G7 country and higher than the G20 average, because it spends the most money, because it is the most costly, it must therefore be the best. But of course, it has simultaneously produced the worst results. Canada now has the highest unemployment in the G7. We went into the crisis with the highest, save France and Italy, whose socialist policies this government had long been trying to emulate. But now, only 100 days later, our economic position is even worse than theirs, even worse than Italy, which bore among the hardest brunt of the COVID crisis. Today, Canada has the worst job record and posture in all of the G7. In other words, they have spent the most to achieve the least. And the only thing they had today for job creation was a new $15 million fund to staff up the Deputy Prime Minister's office. Wow. $15 million. I guess that's enough to create 150 six-figure jobs for political staffers working now for the Deputy Prime Minister. It's funny. The Auditor General asked for $11 million so that she could do her job examining all of this spending. You know, today the Auditor General is doing about 14 audits a year. 10 years ago, the Auditor General's office did 28 audits a year, twice as many. Government spending today is over $600 billion. Back then, it was about $250 billion. In other words, spending is up by more than double, and the number of audits are down by half, which means we have a quarter of the accountability. So today, we would just assumed that in this massive spending splurge, they would find $10 or $11 million for the Auditor General. Compared to the other spending they're doing, it's not very much. In fact, this government is now spending almost exactly $1 million per minute. So in the time I give my speech, they could have fully funded the Auditor General. But they did not have money for the Auditor General. They had $15 million for the Deputy Prime Minister. Now, I'm sure that later today, when I move a motion in the House of Commons, that we will shift that $15 million from the Deputy Prime Minister to the Auditor General, we will have no problem getting unanimous consent. I'm looking around and I see violent agreement from all sides of the House of Commons, and I'm sure that it will be a mere perfunctory matter of procedure to get it done when I move my motion later on. But it is interesting that this government's only job creation measure in today's presentation was in the Deputy Prime Minister's office. So what could we do as an alternative? Well, we as Conservatives are proposing to transform the COVID programs into pro-growth, pro-job initiatives. Let's go through the list. The wage subsidy. We believed, in fact, we supported a generous wage subsidy in order to keep our workers active and contributing.
There's no doubt that the situation in which we find ourselves is unprecedented. And I am not going to be an opposition party critic beating a loud drum about the numbers, which are on their own quite shocking. But they're not a surprise. They're not unexpected. So, yes, this snapshot tells us that our deficit will be $343 billion this year. The snapshot tells us that we've smashed through, as Pierre Poilievre was just saying upstairs, smashed through the $1 trillion debt mark. If, in fact, the Minister of Finance and the Government of Canada were charting a course to this much red ink and this much debt out of some domestic impetus, a political motive, losing track of their senses, all of us in the House would be up in arms. But this has to be taken in context of a global pandemic in which every other country around the world and every other economy is struggling. In fact, Canada's doing better than most, and the reality is we're fortunate that we went into the pandemic with a healthier debt-to-GDP ratio than any other country in the G7 and with full employment. So we are looking at a very significant economic wallop. And what rises to me as being probably the most important sentence in this report, I'll turn to it, it's at page 59, is the reference that, quote, the recovery path is uncertain and fundamentally linked to the equally uncertain health outcomes. So this is, for Greens, a wake-up call to humanity. We look at this and we say, what this tells us is the economy takes a back seat to nature. I mean, we are human animals. We've just got an invisible, parasitic, microscopic virus that's brought a large economy to its knees. But we're not down for the count. We'll come back from this. All the economic indicators in this report, in the fiscal update, don't chart a clear path exactly how we'll do it. But we have got the strength in our economy to do this. It's not great that we've been hit with a pandemic. All things being equal, I would rather COVID-19 had not surfaced. But with a pandemic, this spending was necessary. Otherwise, our economy would have been much more damaged than it has already been. More Canadians would have died. And this is a clear message. Our health as an economy is completely dependent on our health as human beings. If we get control of the pandemic and we don't loosen our resolve and we don't reopen too quickly, we can recover. The biggest economic risks for us right now are in ignoring threats that are essentially not economic or fiscal factors. Our biggest threats are ignoring COVID-19, and I must stress, a bigger threat is ignoring the climate emergency. We cannot rewrite the rules of nature. We can revisit the rules with which we manage our economy. I think it's time to take a serious look at modern monetary theory. It's time to go after the offshore tax accounts. It's time to go after a wealth tax. It's time to ensure we climb out of this economic downturn with investments in the economy of the future, in renewable energy, and in technologies and government programs that are largely going to continue to be government spending to get us out of this, that ensure we survive the climate crisis. And with that, I'll take any questions anyone might have.
Well, now we'll go to questions, starting with questions on the phone. Reminder, one question, one follow-up per reporter. Nous allons maintenant aller aux questions. Commençons par les questions au téléphone. Un petit rappel que c'est une question suivie par journaliste. Operator, do we have a first question?
Thank you. Merci. As a reminder, please press star 1 if you have any questions. De nouveau, n'hésitez pas à appuyer sur étoile 1 pour toute question. There are no questions registered at this time. I'd like to turn the meeting back over to you.
Okay, we'll take a question from the room.
You mentioned briefly about climate change, and I'm wondering, as the economy is slowly regaining some strength, as people slowly start to go to work, and as the government now has to focus on paying off $300 billion in debt, do you have any concern that climate change is going to take a backseat, that the federal government will not have the money necessary to continue fighting climate change in perhaps the way that it had initially wanted to when it was elected, and that businesses and everyday individuals will no longer prioritize climate change needs or reduction in plastic and put that money elsewhere?
Thank you for the question. And look, the reality, the economic and fiscal reality is that the private sector isn't going to have recovered sufficiently from the economic hit of COVID-19 that they will be the source of funds. It is going to have to be government stimulus spending. This is a global reality. So internationally, the best economists in the world are saying the best way to invest in an economy, to get the economy functioning again, to get people back to work, is through investments in renewable energy, is through investments in eco-energy retrofits to buildings, and things like tree planting. So that economic advice aligns with the climate advice. So although it may be somewhat intuitive that there's going to have to be money spent for climate and it will compete with money spent for the economy, empirically speaking, the evidence is that spending money for actions that address the climate crisis are the best ways for a government to focus spending if you want an economic recovery.
Okay. On the deficit, we are now, the federal government is projecting this $300 billion deficit, and that's only a snapshot of what we're facing currently, not, into the future, a year, in case we have a second wave or a third wave, as many experts have been projecting. You also said that the federal government is going to have to be the one that puts the money into the Canadian economy, that helps Canadians get back on their feet. And I'm wondering how long you think the federal government needs to be there for people, providing that initial support, providing the money that enables them to stay home or to support businesses to stay afloat. How much money can the federal government spend? Do you see it as endless in a sense, or is there a time where the spending has to stop?
This is where it's an excellent question. Obviously, we don't want to see the government borrowing from commercial banks and putting ourselves in a position where down the road, interest rates change. Right now, Bill Morneau is absolutely right. The carrying cost of debt, dealing with it, is manageable. The cost of borrowing is almost zero. We're going to spend less on interest payments on our debts this year than we spent last year. The debt's grown enormously, but the interest rates have slashed. So we're in a very interesting economic situation. But under the current approach to what would say conventional economics of the last couple decades, this is not something you can keep doing forever. That's why I think modern monetary theory, which would say, look, as a sovereign country, we do not incur any risk if we're using the Bank of Canada to increase the amount of cash available to do things that need to be done. And it does not look on current fiscal realities and on the current economics as though that it all risks inflation. In fact, Governor Steve Poloz, when he was asked about it, the governor of the Bank of Canada at the time, said inflation is a problem he would love to have because he thinks a far bigger risk is deflation. Now, this kind of large-scale conversation, I firmly believe, should take place in the context of the G7 together. What do we do to rewrite the rules of our normal economic assumptions of how we operate within the International Monetary Fund, what the function is for the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the other Bretton Woods institutions in the context of an unprecedented economic event, public health crisis? So it's not to say that we can keep spending money forever under current rules and not be in trouble. We're fine for now. A second wave, additional more spending, I think it's time to be far more innovative with what our economic assumptions are. As I said, we can rewrite the rules of our economic realities. We can rewrite the rules of how we deal with liquidity. We can rewrite the rules of how we deal with the Bank of Canada versus commercial banks. We can't rewrite COVID-19's genetic structure. We can't rewrite the reality of atmospheric chemistry. It is a reality which we must face and which humanity can't control. We can control economic decisions so that we continue to spend the money that needs to be spent so that we get through this as a healthy society.
I'll check on the phone and then I'll come back to you.
Sure.
Operator, can I verify that we still have no question on the phone, or do we have a question?
There are still no questions registered.
Perfect. We'll continue in the room.
Sure. One of the things that the federal government has done is the CERB, so that Canadians can stay home getting some money. And that's only been extended by 8 weeks. Do you see this as a program that needs to continue, especially if we do have a second or third wave? And do you think it ultimately, if we do get more waves, ends up becoming a universal basic income?
Thank you. I think we need to actually make that decision proactively, that guaranteed livable income makes sense, bring it into play earlier rather than later, and recognize that one of the advantages is that unlike CERB, you are not given an incentive to stay home. The incentive is to get out of poverty, but as soon as you're able to go back to work, you can make more than $1,000 a month and you pay it back in taxes. I think we need to actually look at the Parliamentary Budget Office preliminary report that came out yesterday and take it farther and look at where are the cost savings for our economy as a whole once we can ensure that no one lives in poverty, no one at all. That makes for a tremendous difference for the cost of our healthcare system. The single largest social determinant of health is poverty. Eliminating poverty will have other large benefits in our society, including in the correctional system. It's very expensive to house someone for a full year in jail. It's much cheaper to make sure they have education, food on the table, and a roof over their head. So there are multiple benefits to a guaranteed livable income, and I'm very pleased that in this one of the last great progressive conservatives, Senator Hugh Segal, has written the book Bootstraps Need Boots. It's pretty fundamental on the left of a spectrum and the right of a spectrum that this is a transformative idea for our society that will bring great benefits. And the CERB can be essentially morphed into, but deliberately so, a guaranteed livable income.
Great. Thank you.
This concludes the press conference.
Thank you so much.
La conférence de presse.
Parfait, Mme Thibault, est-ce que vous êtes là?
Oui.
Excellent. Donc, ça a terminé bientôt. Il n'y avait pas de participants de mon côté, malheureusement.
Encore? C'est correct. Pas de problème.
Je vais donc vous transférer dans la préconférence de l'autre.
Parfait, merci.
Bienvenue.
Bonsoir.
Bonsoir. À qui je parle?
À Abdou.
Bonjour Abdou, c'est Christine, la Tribune de la Presse. Ça va bien?
Bonjour, Christine. Je vais très bien, et vous?
Oui. Écoute, est-ce que je peux vérifier les modalités de la conférence avec toi?
Tout à fait. Je suis l'agent dédié à votre appel aujourd'hui.
Merci beaucoup. Premièrement, il n'y a pas d'introduction ou rien. Je vais vous demander de transférer l'appel dans la salle à 15 minutes, à 15h25, donc 5 minutes avant la conférence, avec le son de la salle ici.
D'accord.
Et avertissez-moi quand vous l'aurez fait, comme ça je saurai que c'est bel et bien fait.
D'accord. Donc, je vais enlever la musique. Donc,
oui.
Et je vais joindre dans la main conférence.
Parfait. Ensuite, je crois que c'est le chef du bloc qui va faire la conférence. Il va faire ça. Non, c'est qui? En tout cas, le conférencier va parler, puis quand c'est le temps des questions, je vais lancer aux questions. À ce moment-là, je vais passer aux questions. À ce moment-là, je vais vous lancer la parole. Je vais dire, opérateur, avons-nous une première question? Et si vous en avez pas, vous me le dites. Si vous en avez, vous introduisez avec le nom et le nom du média. En fond, le nom de la personne et le nom du média. Et puis, ils ont droit à une question de suivi. Ils enchaînent habituellement le suivi. Quand c'est le temps d'une autre question, je demande next question ou prochaine question. En fait, ça va être pas mal en français vu que c'est le Bloc québécois.
OK. Donc, l'appel sera entièrement en français.
Probablement. Plus ou moins juste en français. Ouais.
D'accord. Dans mes notes, j'avais bilingual.
Oh, j'ai de la misère à vous entendre. Tout le monde parle dans ma salle. Un instant. Pouvez-vous me répéter ça?
Donc, je disais, dans mes notes, j'avais bilingual call. French and English, but anyway.
Oui, ça se peut qu'il y en ait. On ne défend pas l'anglais. Ça se peut qu'il y ait des gens anglophones qui appellent aussi. Il n'y a pas de problème avec ça. C'est juste que moi, je vais majoritairement vous parler en français quand je vais m'adresser à vous, c'est tout.
Et moi, quand j'annoncerai les questions, je vais juste parler en français, n'est-ce pas?
Oui, vous pouvez. À moins que vous décelez le nom d'un journaliste anglophone, mais bon, à ce moment-là. C'est un peu difficile des fois. Ensuite, c'est pas mal ça. Est-ce que vous aviez des questions pour moi?
Oui, je crois que c'est beau. Vous m'avez dit qu'il n'y a plus d'introduction et j'aimerais aussi confirmer que l'appel n'est pas enregistré.
C'est bien ça?
C'est ça. Et si vous souhaitez que les lignes soient fermées, soient mutées, n'est-ce pas?
Jusqu'à temps qu'on pose les questions, oui.
Oui, bonjour tout le monde.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today, the government presented its economic and fiscal snapshot for 2020. We had been waiting a very long time for this. We asked for it just about at every meeting, and we didn't expect much. But even so, the government managed to disappoint us. What is in this document is sort of all the measures put in place to date. However, it's as if we were still back in April. The government talks about the pandemic, it talks about the measures put in place, of course. But now, we're seeing the economy slowly start to bounce back. And what we expected to see in this document were improvements and adaptations to current programs. For example, CERB. It's $2,000 per month. But if you make $1 over $1,000, you lose everything. And since March, we've been calling for the government to make it like EI. For example, if you earn a certain amount over the limit, then you can keep 50 cents on the dollar, for example. So this would be a type of progressive system, because it's not April anymore, it's July. And unemployment stands at about 12%, and people in businesses have trouble finding workers. Same thing for the wage subsidy. It's the rules are still the same. You have to have 30%, but if you have 29%, you lose everything. So it needs to be more progressive. Another aspect of the wage subsidy, well, about a month ago, the government had tabled C-17. We expected to vote on it in the House. And within that, there was a change to the wage subsidy to include seasonal industries such as tourism and culture. But that still hasn't been debated on yet. Perhaps the most important point for the Bloc Québécois in its demands are the transfers to the provinces and territories. The government talked about its $14 billion amount, but they attached strings to that. Now, for Quebec and the provinces, their healthcare needs are more than $14 billion, because the government can't just attach strings. This would have been the perfect opportunity to give us the money with no strings attached, because you've got for example, in Quebec, the National Assembly and its frontline workers are there fighting the pandemic. And so they could have said, well, we'll encourage you. Here's the money. You know, a few $1 billion for Quebec. You should be spending it on the pandemic. But once again, this is a missed opportunity on the part of the federal government. In English, they say that there's a snapshot of the current economic context. But what we say is that you take the picture and then it disappears after a few seconds. And this seems to be the case for this document. Because, yes, it's a snapshot. We have the figures for the deficit related to public debt as well. We're talking about massive amounts, but they're, once again, $343 billion as of March 31st, 2021. But I'd be willing to bet serious money. Right now, we're at $343 billion. But what about when we get to the end of next year? What will the amount be then? That's only if the government didn't adopt any other measure between now and then. But, you know, what about the assistance for persons with disabilities in C-17? That attracted broad consensus across all party lines. But the government said, well, if you don't accept C-17 as is, well, we're not going to table it. There will be no vote. And to date, the government could have brought C-17 back.
so that we could debate it and vote on it in the House, but it still hasn't done so. But they still decided to put that measure in the snapshot, but they didn't put in place the adaptations and the changes that we were calling for example, to CERB and the wage subsidy. We want vulnerable sectors to be addressed. We want them to receive assistance as well. So this is quite disappointing for the Bloc Québécois. So these are our main comments. If you have any questions regarding transport, I'd like to refer you to my colleague Xavier Barsalou-Duval. He is the one who's the critic for the matters concerning Air Canada. The fact that there has been these terrible cuts to regional routes by Air Canada. So we'll take questions. Thank you.
Une question de suivi. You can ask your question in both official languages. Opérateur, avons-nous une première question?
Merci. Nous allons maintenant passer à la période de questions. Si vous utilisez un téléphone main libre, s'il vous plaît, soulevez le combiné avant d'effectuer votre sélection. Si vous désirez poser une question, veuillez s'il vous plaît appuyer sur le touche étoile 1 de votre téléphone à clavier. Vous pouvez à tout moment annuler votre question en appuyant sur le dièse. Il y aura un court délai vous permettant de vous enregistrer dans la file d'attente pour la période de questions. Merci de patienter. La première question est de Catherine Lévesque.
Catherine Lévesque.
La presse canadienne. La parole est à vous.
La presse canadienne.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Bonjour, messieurs. J'avais une
Thank you.
question, en fait, sur le portrait économique.
I have questions on the economic snapshot from today. And with regard to the size of the deficit, is the Bloc Québécois shocked? What needs to happen? Should there be certain cuts? What needs to be done to achieve a balance or to pay down the deficit? Thank you for the question. When we compare the economy to those of G7 and G20 countries, we can see that the government is taking measures that increase debt and that cost a fortune. But basically, what the economists are saying is that that is the lesser of all evils. Canada has spent more than other countries, for example, Germany, Japan, and France, but it had the lowest debt levels before COVID. And now what we're hearing is that even with this spending, when we compare this with G7 countries, Canada has one of the best GDP to debt ratios in the world, one of the lowest. So that is the least worst situation, if you will. But what we have said for a very long time is, for example, the GAFA web giants, they're not paying their fair shares, their fair share. And so now we're in a situation where the government is spending a lot of money. Everyone has to pay their fair share, and the government must step up and say, listen, web giants, especially given the pandemic, they're doing even better business now. Everyone's watching Netflix, they're going on Facebook, people buy more things on Amazon. Not me necessarily, but those companies need to pay their fair share. Tax avoidance and tax evasion have gone on long enough. The government needs to step up. And so, given that the debt is rising, then the money that is being spent must be done so the right way. And that is why we are saying that we had asked for the $14 billion that the government is providing. That's fine to have a deficit for that. With regard to changes to CERB, well, that is going to cost a little bit more. So we're talking about $6 billion, but that incentivizes people to return to work. And, once all the healthcare restrictions are in place and once the conditions are in place, people should be able to go back to work. And so the government needs to adapt these measures to the current needs of the economy. So if we were in April, if it was April, that would be fine. But it's July now, so money has to be spent more responsibly. Thank you.
Et puis, le 14 milliards, il est toujours avec condition, mais
Now, there are still conditions attached to the $14 billion, but I have a question about something you said earlier. CERB might come to an end at some point, and EI would kick in. So the wage subsidy might become more popular in coming months. What do you think about that transition? It seems inevitable in the months to come. So what is your message on that? Answer. Well, it seems inevitable. Well, here we've got this snapshot. If everything is going to change in the next few months, then the government needs to be transparent. It needs to tell us what it's going to do, what you have just mentioned. For example, the end of CERB and going back to the EI. There are 186 pages here, and I don't see any mention of that. So, I haven't seen a single word on that. So, if it was the time, the opportunity today to mention that. So what we want is that for people who can't work because of the pandemic, they need support. They need to be able to continue to pay their rent. But at the same time, we want an incentive to return to work. Is the EI formula, would that be the best one? Perhaps. But we need to discuss that, and that's why the government needs to be transparent. The government is a minority government, but you can't tell by reading this document. What I would say is that at first we said, well, why should EI come to an end? Well, the Finance Minister said, well, the system couldn't deal with that many claims, that many applications. But what happens if there's a second wave? Will the system be just as incapable of handling all the applications? So the government needs to tell us where it stands, what its plans are. And it needs to, the government needs to deliver the goods. Thank you.
Merci. De nouveau, n'hésitez pas à appuyer sur étoile 1 pour toute question. N'hésitez pas à appuyer sur étoile 1 pour toute question. Nous n'avons plus de questions pour le moment. J'aimerais maintenant retourner la parole à vous, Madame Thibault.
We'll take questions from the room. Claire?
Hi, it's Annie with CTV National News. You were mentioning you would like a change to the CERB and other programs. What specifically do you think needs to be changed about the CERB? And should it be extended beyond just that initial 8 weeks, basically around for people as long as the pandemic exists?
CERB, c'est la prestation d'urgence? Oui. Oui, ben, ce qu'on veut, c'est d'avoir...
What we would like, what we've been calling for since March, is an incentive for people to return to work. So what we suggested, and I mean, we're open to all kinds of discussions, but our proposal was that beyond any $1,000 that the person earns, if that person earns $1 more, then they don't lose everything. So it should reflect EI as in being a progressive system. So people should be able to keep 50 cents on every dollar. And that way, the government needs to keep support measures in place as long as certain people can't go back to work, because we're not back to pre-COVID times yet. These measures need to be put in place progressively to support people because, as the economists say, what previous crises have shown us is that if there are no support measures in place, then the recovery will be much more difficult. Thank you.
No follow-up? I'll check one more time if we have a new question on the phone. Opérateur, s'il vous plaît, avons-nous une prochaine question?
Non, nous n'avons plus de questions pour le moment.
No more questions on the phone.
Conférence de presse, merci.
Bon, merci beaucoup.
Everyone can agree on the fact that all of these programs cover everyone because it is clear that some people have slipped through the cracks, including disabled persons. The exact number, $750 million for banks, but nothing for the disabled in Canada. 3 million Canadians live with a serious disability in Canada, so that has to be fixed. The government has to do something. I know the NDP leader and the NDP caucus is pushing the government on that point. The government has to do something. It has to address that issue, and it needs to help persons living with disabilities in Canada.
Repeat the very eloquent words of the leader of the NDP in terms of talking about this economic snapshot and the reality of this government not addressing the revenue side in any way, which allows us to make the investments that will help people. He said it very eloquently. I think his words stand. What I would like to talk about is what a moment we are in at this time, in this place, in this country. The finance minister just stood in the House and said that all hands on deck, we are all in this together. And I think given the many neglected groups that we have been raising in the House, it's very clear that that is not the case yet. And it is not the case that Canada is responding the way it should to this pandemic. And to understand what we need to do now and what we need to do moving forward, we can look at the historical precedents of the Great Generation in the Second World War. Now, Madam Speaker, you're well aware of this. In the 1920s, we had, as we do today, incredible inequalities, a concentration of wealth that has not been repeated until now. In 1929, it reached its zenith. Today, as we know, because the Parliamentary Budgetary Officer has told us, 1% of Canadians now possess as much wealth as 80% of Canadians. That was the case in 1929, and that was one of the reasons why we had the Great Depression, a collapse of our economy. And then Canadians joined the fight against fascism, and Canadians went overseas. Many left their lives. Many did not survive. 2 members of my family are on the cenotaph in New Westminster in front of the City Hall. And so many other families across this nation sacrificed. And at that time, Madam Speaker, that generation said that we are in a watershed moment. We do not want to go back to the old normal, the normal of inequalities, the great economic meltdown that we saw. We want to build a better society. I'm not pretending, Madam Speaker, that the great generation was perfect. Of course, they did not deal with the reality of colonialism and addressing reconciliation with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. They did not address systemic racism. They did not address those realities, and the devastation is still felt today. But despite the fact that that generation was not perfect, they did have a vision. And that vision was based on public investments and making sure that, as far as possible, nobody was left behind, that we would build, with public investment, a better country. And they set to work. And Madam Speaker, in my home in New Westminster, we were part of the house that my family and I reside in, built in 1948. We're part of the 300,000 affordable housing units that were built across the length and breadth of our country after the Second World War by people, that great society that decided that they were not going to return to the old normal, that they were going to build a better society, a more equitable and fair society. They built affordable housing. They built the network of hospitals and healthcare centers. And Madam Speaker, as you know, that generation, the great generation following the Second World War, also under the leadership of Tommy Douglas in a minority parliament, much like this one, put in place our universal healthcare center system that stands today as a pillar of one of the things that Canadians are most proud of. We built a system of education, colleges and universities, and high schools. We built highways and public transit. We ensured that there were water systems in many places. We neglected First Nations communities, there's no doubt. But there was a desire to build a new normal that was better than the old normal. And Madam Speaker, we are facing that same watershed moment today. As the leader of the NDP, the member from Burnaby South, has said so eloquently in this House, we have to build a better normal, a new normal. We have to be inspired by the great generation and how they responded to the Second World War. And what does that mean, Madam Speaker, when we talk about a new normal? What does that mean? Well, it means no longer accepting the idea that we are not going to, in a very real sense, end colonialism and put in place true and meaningful, lasting reconciliation with First Nations and Métis people. It means that we must fight, and the member from Burnaby South is the foremost leader in this House of Commons on this issue. We must fight and eliminate systemic racism in all our institutions and in our society. And we must be inspired by the great generation in terms of public investments, ensuring that nobody is left behind, whether we're talking about people with disabilities, whether we're talking about First Nations communities, whether we're talking about single-parent families. We need to make those public investments so that our new normal is different and much, much better than the old normal. I mean, the sobering statistics of the last few decades, after the great generation had finished its work, the subsequent governments, and I criticize equally Liberals and Conservatives in this regard, cut into pieces all that had been built following the Second World War. Cut into pieces that public financing, cut into pieces what was a fair tax system where everybody, rich or poor, paying their fair share of taxes, profitable corporations not being able to take their money offshore, but rather investing it in public investments here. Well, that was cut into pieces in subsequent decades. And now we have this watershed moment of great sacrifice that we are seeing from our frontline healthcare workers and first responders, putting their lives on the line every day. We've seen the devastation in our long-term care facilities. We've seen how people have stepped up, but we've also seen the horrible results and consequences of the thousands of lives lost in Canada. Their lives lost must stand for something. And that means we need to step up, both during the pandemic to make sure that nobody is left behind. And as the member from Burnaby South said eloquently just a few minutes ago, that starts with people with disabilities who have received no supports during this pandemic. And it means coming out in the rebuilding phase, that we have to build that new normal much better than the old. One that addresses the needs of everybody in this country. One that ensures meaningful national reconciliation with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, that eliminates the systemic racism that we have seen afflict our country, like so many others, and to make sure that we put in place all of the investments that need to be put into place for the recovery. Things like childcare, things like access to post-secondary education, and the kind of job creation that comes with moving to a clean energy economy, which the member from Burnaby South has also spoken very eloquently to. We have a new normal to establish, Madam Speaker, and the NDP caucus is ready to work with all members of Parliament. So coming out of this pandemic, we have a much better country than going in. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. Within the Liberal caucus, members virtually on a daily basis are bringing forward ideas and thoughts in terms of what it is that we could be doing in order to improve the many different programs we've brought in over the last few months to support Canadians. And this is something in which we have taken seriously, not only from government members, but also from opposition members, recognizing that we need to have that higher sense of cooperation in order to provide the better services that Canadians are going to need in a time of a pandemic. Madam Speaker, we've seen that through direct assistance, through CERB, through wage subsidy, through direct support for seniors, childcare, families, businesses, and so much more, Mr. Speaker. I agree with the member to the degree in which we do need to take this opportunity and to continue to explore ways in which we can better the system. We can maybe even continue on with some of the things that we started when we first took government 4, 5, 6 years ago, Madam Speaker. And I'm wondering if my friend could just provide his thoughts in terms of just continuing the momentum on many of those social policies that we started in the last number of months.
The Honourable Member for New Westminster. Burnaby,
thank you, Madam Speaker. I don't disagree with the member, but we have raised repeatedly issues in this House that actually received the support of all members of Parliament. People with disabilities. It has now been 3 months since a motion passed unanimously through this House calling on the government to move immediately, without delay, to putting in place supports for all people with disabilities in this country. We are now 3 months later. Those Canadians with disabilities are struggling to put food on the table, to keep a roof over their head, and they have received no supports at all, despite the collaboration of every single member of Parliament. The government needs to act, and we know that they can act quickly. When the banks came, and they didn't consult Parliament, $750 billion, $750 billion was handed out without batting an eye. It is time now for this government. People with disabilities, we have passed.
I'm sorry. Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. On Monday, I had an opportunity to visit Suncor and Shell facilities in my own riding and just see the incredible adaptations that are happening in the energy sector to allow people to be able to continue to work, but all kinds of innovations in terms of safety protocols around ensuring that there isn't the spread of COVID-19. And really, that's what we need to do. We need to adapt so that people can get back to work. And I hear the members of the NDP talking about using this opportunity to dramatically change aspects of our social system, and we can obviously have those debates. But our central goal needs to be, I hope the member agrees, giving people the greatest possible opportunity to work in a safe way by supporting the deployment of adaptations. That's going to involve some changes, some expansion of certain sectors perhaps. I wonder if the member could comment on if he supports the Conservative proposal for a back-to-work bonus to help ensure that it is always more profitable for people to be able to return to work.
The honourable member for New Westminster, Burnaby.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And as the member knows, I came out of the oil and gas industry. I'm a former refinery worker at the Shelburne refinery in Burnaby, British Columbia, now closed, as did so many refineries, because we basically gutted the manufacturing and transformation part of that sector. And so I am a strong advocate for clean energy and believe in getting energy workers back to work in the clean energy sector. There is no doubt when we look at climate change, the climate emergency is already costing us $5 billion a year. In terms of economic costs, that is only going to accelerate, Madam Speaker, as you're well aware. That'll go to $50 billion over the next 2 decades. So we have to act now. And that means providing supports for that transition to clean energy. Now, the member also cites a transition in CERB. We have been pushing, as he's well aware, on transitional measures within the wage subsidy so that the wage subsidy is open to all businesses and nonprofits. We have not seen action from the government yet on that, but that is our priority for the moment.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to begin by acknowledging that we're on the territory of the Algonquin Nation and once again express deep appreciation for their patience and generosity, make which. Today we look at the first ever in the history of Canada, tabled by a Minister of Finance, economic snapshot. We used to see full budgets, and we used to then have economic statements. But I am not going to find fault with the fact that we have a snapshot at the moment, because it's hard to know what else we could have. More economic information is always helpful, more transparency is always helpful, and it is clear that the Minister of Finance has made himself available to all parties in this place on a very frequent basis as we chart uncharted waters. Nothing has been perfect. Everything would have been better if delivered faster. But no one's ever gone through anything like this. No other government, no other generation. I suppose we could look at Black Death, but we didn't have access to Zoom meetings then, and we didn't have the ability to chart our course at all. So I would say that on balance, we've been doing as well, and in many cases better, than any government or any country around the world. That's saying something. But it's clearly a dismal economic forecast. We have now over $1 trillion in debt, and we have a deficit this year of $343 billion. It's not going to be easy to get out of this crisis, but it's very clear that our economic health is intrinsically tied to our personal health.
As the report says, and I quote, "The way forward towards a greener future remains uncertain, and it is closely connected to public health. And the area of public health is also uncertain. It's obvious that today we are living through a pandemic."
This is not normal spending. Nothing is about this is normal. But it's not disastrous. We have a path out of the economic disaster that is completely dependent on our path out of the health nightmare in which we find ourselves.
It's never been as clear that the economy stands behind nature. Today, nature is the boss.
Humanity, if we needed reminding that we're not in charge. We can have the best economic plans, we can have the best fiscal plans, we can have, as we had before this pandemic, the best debt to GDP ratio in the G7. We had full employment. We now have significant unemployment. None of this was foreseeable. A microscopic virus, a parasite, has attacked humanity. It leaves the animals alone for once. It's focused on humanity, and we spread it through our travel. We spread it through community spread. We've now learned all these new phrases, and we had to flatten that curve. The spending, for the most part, that we find described in this document was spending agreed to, and I think this speaks so well of us as parliamentarians, the spending was agreed to by unanimous consent. We rolled out extraordinary measures. We now know the names, the CERB. We're used to it now, our COVID emergency relief benefit, to millions of Canadians. Rolled out help to businesses in the CEBA. We rolled out help in the wage subsidy. These things have helped our economy from being worse off than we now are. It held the drop in GDP to probably about 3 points less of a drop than we would have had. That's what the economic snapshot tells us. So our economy is doing better, and our health is doing better, because our health and the economy are completely linked. I want to make the other point, of course, that our economy is also not in charge of the climate emergency. We as human beings can no more rewrite the genetic code of the COVID-19 virus than we can rewrite atmospheric chemistry. We cannot rewrite the rules of physics that mean that the climate emergency is a larger threat to our long-term survival than COVID-19. We can revisit and potentially rewrite some of our economic rules, because we made those up. Humanity invented those. We can revisit them. We can certainly, for instance, consider that now might be a good time while we talk about unprecedented threats and unprecedented economic downturn. Frequent reference has been made, including by the Parliamentary Budget Office, to the fact that the comparisons with where we are now are not against where we were in 2008, 2009, but more reasonably the end of the Second World War and during the Second World War. Our spending matches more of what we saw then. Our recovery will also match more of what we saw then, which means I mentioned in this House a few months ago, I'll mention again, I think Canada should step up in a lead role globally, or at least be a catalyst as a catalytic lead role, and say, isn't it time to have something akin to the Bretton Woods Conference again? Don't we need to rethink what's the role of the World Bank, the Bretton Woods institutions that were created then, to help chart the global economy to recovery post-war? They worked then. International Monetary Fund set fixed currency rates. Since the Bretton Woods institutions and since that conference, the IMF has been relieved of fixing currency rates. We rewrote those rules. Maybe we need to rewrite some other rules. We are looking at a threat to life globally around the world in a post-pandemic famine threat to hundreds of millions of people around the world. And I know it's conventional wisdom for Canadians to say, we can't ask people when they're suffering in Canada to think about the poorest of the poor, but I think we have to. We will emerge from this crisis, this economic crisis, and the COVID-19 crisis, better off than most any other country on earth. And if hundreds of millions of people are dying from lack of food all around the world, that will not fail to reach our shores somehow. But we also have a role to play, and I think we really need to talk about forgiving all developing country debt from all around the world, so these countries that are the poorest of the poor have a fighting chance with additional help for food security to avoid the deaths of hundreds of millions of people, which are now predicted by United Nations relief and food agencies. We also need to rethink the fairness within Canada. This document makes it very clear that Finance Canada understands the need for childcare as I have never seen any Finance Canada document understand the need for childcare. It's clear that people who are looking at our economic health and recovery understand that parents can't go back to work if schools are closed, or if schools aren't safe, or if daycares aren't open, or if they don't have a daycare space. And as I say parents, and it happens there are a number of women MPs at the House at the moment, don't think it fails, and men who understand it too. Thank you to my honorable colleague who is smartly masked. Women, mothers, are the ones who are more likely to be staying home. This is a threat, a demographic threat, an economic threat, the likes of which we haven't seen since the 1960s. The idea that, well, if things are bad and there's no child care, women will stay home. We know that's an economic blow we can't risk, and we know that's a step back in women's rights that we won't accept. We need child care for every child, and we need to be really creative about how we get there. This document points to what's called the Safe Restart Agreement. That is the $14 billion not yet allocated, not yet spent by the federal government to assist provinces. But $14 billion will not cover the 7 items on this list: child care, sick leave, health care capacity, and specifically looking at long-term care homes. I recently was talking to Shauna Stewart, who's the head of the union that represents long-term care workers across Canada, 60,000 workers. She told me that most of those workers are not yet back at work because they don't think the long-term care homes are a safe place for them to work. As long as long-term care homes are in the hands of for-profit enterprises, we cannot be sure that our seniors are going to be well cared for, nor that the workforce who goes in to take care of them, the frontline workers there, are safe, not to mention what kind of food people are served when you decide that you can cut corners every which way to make a profit in a long-term care home. We need to take a look at this federally. We need to figure out how we make Canada Health Act apply for national standards for long-term care homes. There's not enough money in this $14 billion, even for what the municipalities need by themselves, and they're 1 item out of 7 on the list. We need to do more. We need to be prepared to spend more. So with that, I'm going to focus as well on a point made earlier by my colleague from Burnaby. We still, although it's mentioned in here as though it's spent, we still have not done a single thing for people with disabilities. My colleague from New Westminster Burnaby, I'm afraid I abbreviated the name of his riding. The document we have in front of us was written as though the events on June 10th in this place had gone differently. June 10th in this place, the government agreed to split out of a bill that was not acceptable because it involved clawbacks and criminal penalties related to CERB. That was the main thing I found objectionable. But the one-time tax-free payment for Canadians with a valid disability tax credit, in order to be able to do that, we needed to make a legislative change in this place so that that information could be shared from CRA so that the one-time tax credit benefit could go to people receiving the disability tax credit. Bear in mind, that is not the full range of people living with disabilities in Canada who need help, but at least it was a step, and I wanted to take that step. And when we asked for unanimous consent, we didn't get it. Shame on those who said no. We had that one step to take. The Liberal House leader put it before us for unanimous consent, and it should have gone through. But we have to figure out how to get help to people with disabilities, and we have to do it quickly. There are a number of areas that remain unmet, needs that are unmet, and that's in the context of the immediate crisis. When we get past the immediacy of the crisis and build towards restarting our economy, that's where I think we really need to think big. I don't know how many of you noticed the column by Brian Mulroney that appeared as a full-page ad in the Globe and Mail, the back page of one day's paper a few weeks ago. I was pleased to see him call for guaranteed livable income. That's one of the things that I think my colleagues, they're all shaking, they're all agreeing from the benches of the New Democratic Party and Greens. We are firm in our desire to see the CERB transfer over time and quickly to a guaranteed livable income. In the other place, the leader of the independent Senate group asked the Parliamentary Budget Office to look at this and found it would be cheaper than CERB to do it. But that's even without taking into account the savings that would accrue to our public health care system, to our correction system. We need to move to guaranteed livable income as part of the next transformative step. The honourable member from New Westminster Burnaby talked about what happened in this House in the late 1960s, early 70s, when Tommy Douglas and David Lewis and in the government of the Right Honourable Lester B. Pearson put in place the fundamentals of our social safety net. We haven't taken a significant transformative step since. We need to bring in pharmacare. We need to bring in guaranteed livable income. These are the steps that we need when we reimagine our future post-pandemic. We can build back to build back better. We can make sure we don't bounce back, but bounce forward. There are many ways that the phrases are circulating these days in a very active, robust discussion. But that discussion isn't on the fringes when it's Brian Mulroney, our former Prime Minister, progressive conservative, talking about what we need to do, that we need to think big, that we need to be bold. I really loved his takeaway line, quote, "Incrementalism builds increments." We are not in a place right now, dear friends, to build increments. We need to rebuild our economy. We need to restart our economy, and we need to do it in a way that leaves no one behind, including the poorest of the poor wherever they are around the world. We need to step up and take a role that says the climate agenda can't wait. The climate emergency doesn't wait. The climate negotiations for 2020 are postponed till 2021. But if we decide that climate action can also be postponed to 2021, we will certainly play a dangerous game of Russian roulette with our children's future. We need to ensure that as we go forward, and yes, we will need to continue spending, that we invest in renewable energy, in energy efficiency for all of our buildings in retrofits, and we need to also look at things according to global studies on what stimulates the economy best, gets people back to work, and makes a big difference, including things as simple as tree planting, lots of it. So as I look at this economic and fiscal snapshot, I have to say that I find it encouraging. Very few people could look at a fiscal snapshot that says $343 billion deficit and find it encouraging. But we're facing it. And in looking at the economic indicators and our own strength as a nation in being able to handle this, we can. We are very, very fortunate that we went into this with the economic health and the strength that we did. We have a lot of companies that are still struggling. We mustn't let, if we can help it, we have to help avoid bankruptcies. We have to help small business. We have to ensure our municipalities receive the help they need. And to do that, the federal government must continue to spend. To do otherwise, to be frightened by people who say, well, look at the red ink, is to risk a deep depression. We are going to have to continue to go down this road. And the best way to do that, I believe now, is to look at modern monetary theory and ask ourselves why we want to borrow from commercial banks when, as long as we're dealing with sovereign wealth and sovereign debt, we can borrow from ourselves and keep those funds within Canada and not let us be at the mercy of commercial banks or New York bond raiders. It's time to say, what do we do as a sovereign nation? How do we embrace our future and do it without the, I don't want to say bean counter, narrow-minded, lack of vision kinds of folks out there. I want to say, let's be as positive about this as we can be. Let's be innovative. When we look at the problem, for instance, for schools opening, we know that schools can't open because there's not enough space to have physical distancing for the children because the schools are small compared to what's going to be needed. We've got to stop thinking about jurisdictional barriers and be really creative. Where is there a lot of empty space for school children? I think it's the convention centers that are going to stay empty. Can't we think past our own jurisdictional constitutional boundaries for once and say, this is an emergency. If we want kids back at school and we want teachers back teaching them, which is what teachers want, where do we have assets that can be mobilized quickly? It's now early July. Schools are supposed to open in September. Nobody really has a plan that I can see. So yes, we need childcare. Yes, we need our schools opening. Yes, we need to work together federally, provincially, municipally, with Indigenous governments, Métis, Inuit, First Nations. Every set of smart, innovative, creative Canadians need to come to the table. And when we come to the table, let's come not ready to bash each other down, but help bring each other up. Because as Canadians, we know we are blessed. We know we are not out of the woods yet, we know that. But we're smart enough to know we listen to the science. We have to listen to the science on COVID-19. We have to listen to the science on the climate emergency. And we have to look to those who are the most innovative, the most creative throughout our economy. And with that, I want to thank you for the opportunity for sharing some thoughts about this snapshot, which I hope I have delivered back to everyone in what we no longer have, Kodak, full-color spectrum, Kodachrome. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Long Range Mountains.
And always it's a pleasure to listen to my friend and colleague from Saanich Gulf Islands. I'm on one coast of this country and she's on the other. I've been in Ottawa the last couple of days with another colleague on FIWO, Status of Women meetings, and it was very clear that we heard the impact that COVID-19 has had on women from coast to coast to coast. Indigenous women, women of color, women in the new workforce, women in the old workforce. And we also heard the Finance Minister make mention of that today, the impact that COVID-19 is having severely on women in our country. I'd like to ask my honourable colleague going forward as we look down the road of recovery, what advice does she have for my minister, the Minister of Women and Gender Equality, of how we get women back on the level playing field and how we get our economy going, knowing that women is a good part of it?
Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Well, I want to thank my friend from Long Range Mountains. This document is exceptional for the depth of analysis on gender-based analysis of a statement. I don't think I've ever seen Annex 1 of this for people watching us from home is taking it program by program, sector by sector. How has the COVID-19 pandemic affected women? So the gender-based assessment is clear. I would say the answer is three things: childcare, childcare, childcare. Women right now are at risk of being put back in the home because there's no one else to look after the kids, and we need childcare.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I appreciate a couple of the attitudes that the Honourable Member mentioned in her speech, and that's the need for creativity and the need to be positive. And when it comes to the need for creativity, I wish there was more creative thinking in terms of making sure that Parliament could have sat over the last 3 months so we could have had fulsome and regular debates, including private members' business and whatnot, over these past number of months as this country faced an unprecedented crisis. And certainly when it comes to the attendance, of members, I know a number of members that are not listed in the minutes, as some of my other colleagues have mentioned, because they had to watch on CPAC because of technical challenges. So I wish that creativity could have been exercised in this place. But specifically to my honourable friend across the way, I think that unleashing that positive entrepreneurial spirit is absolutely key to a good recovery. And I know that there are many examples specifically within the energy sector in my constituency see cutting-edge environmental science that is moving our world-class energy industry forward, but we need a plan to move forward. And unfortunately, the fiscal update today did not outline a plan to move forward. It was simply that looking back. And I wonder if the member agrees that over the last number of months, the 700-plus staff in the Department of Finance could have been working on a budget that certainly I would have been happy to sit this summer in debate, so that we as Canadians and as members of Parliament could see the plan for this country going forward, as opposed to a fiscal selfie that simply talks about the $350-some billion deeper in the red that will be.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you. I thank my friend for Battle River Crowfoot for giving me the perfect opportunity to say, I can't imagine how we could be sitting physically in this place without being a threat to the health of the people in our communities at home and to our own health. And I don't understand why the Conservatives persist in saying we could be sitting here. All we need, and I'm begging the honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot to be the voice of reason within his caucus, let us vote remotely. We're voting from home in British Columbia's legislature, which includes some very far-flung areas. We are voting remotely in British Columbia. Other countries are voting remotely. If we could vote remotely, we could bring forward private members' bills. We could bring forward the bill that's languishing for medical assistance in dying reform, which is desperately needed. We could be bringing forward the legislation we need for a Climate Accountability Act. We are in this place unable to pass something as simple as allowing the Government of Canada to have eyes on who receives the disability tax credit because of a refusal to go with unanimous consent. We need to vote remotely. In a pandemic, not otherwise, but in a pandemic, we need to function fully.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to comment and ask a few questions of the minister or the member from Saanich Gulf Islands. I was moved by the comments we've heard from the member for Burnaby South, the New Westminster Burnaby, and the member from Saanich Gulf Islands. In terms of building back better, in terms of our opportunity to do this, one of the things that I notice is that what we have right now is a global pandemic, and it will require a global response. And we understand that we can't stop the pandemic if we try to be insular within Canada. So I really did appreciate the comments that the member made, but I wonder if she would agree with me that we would love to see a recommitment to the Sustainable Development Goals. It's the high-level political forum at the United Nations right now, virtually, of course, but whether or not we should be reconfirming to our commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals, and whether we could have a 1% of our COVID spending, just 1% of our COVID spending, going to help those around the world that are suffering so much at this time.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you. And I want to also thank the honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.